Good morning, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. So we are here doing a little retreat with all the residents. So I thought that this morning we could actually read one of my favorite suttas that is very suitable for a retreat, which is the Kaya Sutta from the Bojjhanga Samyutta, and it's a discourse on the hindrances that pretty much, well, big obstacle in everyday life, but in particular, we actually see it very much alive and well during retreat time. So before we begin reading the words of the Buddha, we can start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here today. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namassami. And in the comment section, you should be able to find a copy of the sutta, which is the translation of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So I will be reading from Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. Atsavati. Monastics. Just as this body, sustained by nutriment, subsists in dependence on nutriment, it does not subsist without nutriment. So too, the five hindrances sustained by nutriment subsist in dependence on nutriment and do not subsist without nutriment. And what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen sensual desire and for the increase and expansion of arisen sensual desire? There is monastics the sign of the beautiful. Frequently giving careless attention to it is the nutriment for the arising of an unarisen sensual desire and for the increase and expansion of arisen sensual desire. So we see that the Buddha makes it quite clear is that these hindrances that essentially impede us from seeing clearly essentially are the fuel of avidya, the source of all our suffering, essentially. It's not something that has a life in and of itself, in and of its own, but it's something actually that feeds from something, that comes from something. So this, in essence, is actually the whole empowerment, actually, of the Buddhist teachings, is understanding where things are originating. What are the causes and conditions that we're putting essentially in motion every time and creating a result, and understanding whether that's the result that we're looking for or whether that is a result that is essentially a hindrance. So the first hindrance that the Buddha is talking about here is kamachanda. So essentially, delight in lust, the delight in sensuality, delight in all sorts of pleasant experiences that we would like to have in the world. And essentially, how does that come into being? The Buddha points out it's essentially constantly paying attention to everything that we appreciate in samsara, to everything that is pretty, that is glittery, that is, essentially what is kind of flavorful, both metaphorically and actually really, really so. For example, during a retreat, there's not much going on, especially if we are taking the practice of not reading, not not speaking, if we're in noble silence, and so forth. So usually the biggest kind of source of entertainment is breakfast and lunch, and possibly allowables if there are allowables during the retreat. So what are we experiencing there? We can kind of really see how perhaps yeah, we're kind of looking forward to, where is the sort of um, almond butter spread, or where is the milk that I want, or where is that sort of cereal that I like, and really looking forward to that experience, and constantly looking at it, constantly chasing it. And in that way, we're essentially fueling that constant desire, constant wanting to experience pleasant things in the world. And yeah, the Buddha here is highlighting how this is not only increasing it, but it's also expanding it. It's basically creating a condition for this to constantly be part of our experience. And so, what I like to bring to mind in terms of the sign of the beautiful is actually somewhat the metaphor that I normally use for myself, which is the metaphor of the ice cream. So normally we tend to focus very much on the aspect of the creaminess of the ice cream, but not really much on the ice part of the ice cream, which, unless it's August, it can actually feel quite somewhat unpleasant, right? There's usually a sort of kind of physicality of the icy part, the sense, especially if one has sensitive teeth. That can be, yeah, a little bit unpleasant. So when we're actually even having something that normally we think is good, normally we think is yeah, it's a source of pleasant satisfaction. Are we actually fully being completely aware of it, or are we actually instead focusing only on one part, the part that essentially we're kind of grasping towards, that we are cultivating in our mind? And so when we instead somewhat look at the drawbacks of our experience, look at something that is not 100% there, is not 100% fulfilling. Well, first and foremost, we have a more complete, essentially, understanding of our experience, more complete, more true, more real understanding of, in this case, what actually ice cream is, which, yeah, of course, there is a creamy part, but there's also an icy part. And so there is a gratification, but there's also some kind of like danger that we can immediately somewhat taste, literally and figuratively. And that kind of creates a little bit of a less attachment towards the creaminess, less obsession towards the creaminess, and kind of we can let it a little bit more more go. Whether there's ice cream or not on the table, it's a little bit okay. It's fine. We don't have to constantly be chasing everything that we like. Mm. And so then, of course, the practice that is highly recommended in general to overcome this particular hindrance is to also engage in meditation practice in all those practices that essentially cultivate repulsiveness, the sign of the repulsiveness. So, for example, a soba meditation. So, yeah, what is essentially not that beautiful in our experience, whether it's once again food, or whether it's also bodies, or whether it's also Teddy the cat here. He's giving me a hard time, our resident cat. It's difficult to see, yeah, the drawbacks of Teddy, except if you're trying to give a talk. And yeah, and he keeps on being a little bit restless, right, moving here and there. But yeah, anyway, so the whole point of these practices is not to kind of become a Debbie Downer, not to somewhat depress the mind, but rather, once again, have a full experience, make the mind a little bit more balanced, a mind that understands that, of course, there is gratification in some side. If there wasn't any gratification, we wouldn't be hooked up on it. So let's be real here, there is something pleasant about it. There is something good, but we have to not delude ourselves and constantly chasing what we think is good, and actually be aware of its drawbacks, be aware of, well, the sides that are not quite great, as we were talking about earlier, but also the fact that it's impermanent. Even in the best case scenario, even if you are, eating some really damn good pasta cooked right al dente with the perfect ingredients, not too many, not too few, with a perfect view. These are all in my home country. There are certain situations that are really kind of like really great, perfect. But even in that sort of case, best case scenario, where everything is kind of just perfect, even that is impermanent, even that is subject to change, even that is not reliable. How many times can you have the same quote unquote sort of perfect moment without actually getting bored with it, without actually wanting something different? Yeah, you can have the perfect pasta once, maybe twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Actually, I think already if it gets to 5 times, it's already like sort of an incredible success to be content with the same thing for 5 times in a row. Yeah, so understanding that it's not something that we can rely on, not something that we can point our happiness onwards. And so, yeah, from there, from this realization, look a little bit from a way out. And the Buddha continues by saying, and what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen ill will and for the increase and expansion of arisen ill will? There is monastics the sign of the repulsive, frequently giving careless attention to it. Is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen ill will and for the increase and expansion of arisen ill will. So this is one of the also frequently frequent plagues that we have, both in sort of our formal meditation practice and also in our informal meditation practice, which hopefully as Buddhist practitioners is basically the rest of the time that we're not on the cushion, the rest of the time when we're not on retreat. And so, there's this constant sort of push and pull towards things, and really getting displeased if things are not exactly as we want them to be, which is pretty much most of the time, right? If we really start creating a little bit of dispassion towards the sort of first hindrance that we were talking about earlier, then the mind can very much fall into just seeing the drawbacks of everything, entering into a room and just looking at everything that could be better in the best case scenario, or that is completely awful and and horrible. And then, of course, the behavior of the people that surround us, the unenlightened behavior of the people that surround us, since it's very rare to find an enlightened being. Usually we have to deal with unenlightened behavior, which is our unenlightened behavior and the unenlightened behavior of other sentient beings, including this beautiful cat that can be a little bit also difficult to deal with, especially when he cries and wants food and then wants snuggles and then wants something else. He's constantly, just like us, never satisfied, right? So there can be a lot of agitation in the mind, a lot of dukkha, essentially. And so constantly trying to repel what is disagreeable, well, good luck with that. It will just result in essentially creating more and more dukkha in our mind. So the Buddha recommends in these cases to actually, well, first and foremost, to become aware of it, become aware of how our mind essentially works and how it's producing, how it's nourishing all of these thoughts of aversion, and restraining ourselves through body, speech, and mind in every single aspect of our day, when once again, during the mealtime, there can be, as we were saying earlier, lots of greed towards things that we like, but there can be also a lot of aversion towards things that we don't like. Perhaps we were, hoping for salad, and instead there is pizza, or vice versa, right? And so we can have some really strong aversion towards something that is just so really not kind of that important at the end of the day. So from that all the way to pretty much anything, any kind of behavior that we see in others, any even sound that there can be during meditation practice. It's quite remarkable how much aversion there can be towards sound when we're sitting. So much aversion that there can be towards breathing that other people are having, right? It's just so bizarre sometimes when we think about it, because, perhaps if we're out in nature and there's wind, or there's resident cat is really giving me a hard time today. There's wind, if there's a waterfall, if there's lots of different things. Teddy, behave. We're not too judgmental with sound. We're not too critical of sound, right? But then maybe we have a similar sort of experience, and our neighbor next door is breathing a little bit heavily. Perhaps they're actually doing, a lot of times during retreats, there are some former yoga practitioners who like to really do the whole full on kind of thing. And, all the other yoga practitioners are fine, and all the Buddhist practitioners are super triggered. And this defilement, this hindrance can really pervade the mind. And it's just so interesting because if one really analyzes this experience, one starts seeing that actually most of the time the sound isn't even there. But the aversion is there. So it's nothing to do with the sound, but there is something about what we are nourishing the mind with, and that's like kind of looking forward to disappointment, right? Looking forward towards dukkha, and that prevents us from just simply really just enjoying right here and there. And that righteous indignation comes up, right? Why is it? So that we can forgive the wind, or we can forgive the birds, or we can forgive whoever it is, but we can't forgive other humans. There's that sense, oh, this person could just stop. This could be different, right? If only they were a little bit more polite, a little bit more proper, right? You're like, there could be this potential. So that righteous indignation really can pervade the mind, and there's nothing more delicious, I have to say, than righteous indignation, right? Because we have to understand that there's also gratification in anger. If there wasn't gratification in anger, it wouldn't be that idiotic to actually poison ourselves, right? The Buddha calls anger the honey tip with the poison root. And that honey tip is really appealing. And if we think we're right, it's even more so. It's like a double layer of honey, right? So we're just that gratification. But what is the danger there? The poisoning of all our entire experience, the poisoning of the mind, that obsession, that the mind starts becoming very obsessed with all those thoughts that are pernicious, that we can't remove. And we're stuck there. That's why actually the Buddha talks about, as essentially the first hindrance that we were talking about earlier. He talks about essentially that kind of he makes a metaphor of being constantly in debt, and instead in this other hindrance of ill will is instead an illness. So being basically bedridden. Very difficult to get out of it. And I don't think I actually mentioned how to prevent this and to um, unfortunately, I have bad news. It's not by doing the opposite of the previous hindrance. So we should not be all of a sudden like start paying attention to the mark of the beautiful in order to overcome our our aversion, but rather instead develop a mind of loving kindness. Instead, develop the Brahma Viharas, and that creates a really like nice fertile soil for aversion not to be able to germinate essentially. Actually, Bante Sudaso a few weeks ago was really talking about it in a very skillful way of how essentially if we are cultivating constantly metta in particular, but all of the four Brahma Viharas, essentially we're kind of like starting from already like a kind of high standard. So when there are triggering situations, we're not starting from here, but from a low level, but we're starting already from here. So we can go a little bit lower, but we're not actually profounding, I think is Italian, going deep, yeah, falling into this, extreme aversion. And then the Buddha continues by saying, and what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen sloth and torpor, and for the increase and expansion of arisen sloth and torpor? There are monastics discontent, lethargy, lazy stretching, drowsiness after meals, sluggishness of mind. Frequently giving careless attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen sloth and torpor, and for the increase and expansion of arisen sloth and torpor. So this is what the Buddha calls essentially, prison of mind. So whenever we are, we're experiencing drowsiness essentially in meditation, but also drowsiness essentially in not in formal meditation practice. It's very difficult. It impedes. It's very easy to see how actually this particular hindrance clouds knowledge. Which, by the way, all these five hindrances, even one of them, clouds our ability to see things as they are. But this one in particular, I think we can all understand it straight away. I mean, it's very difficult when we are, when we're drowsy in meditation to even stay awake, let alone to see things as they really are, right? So it's quite obvious. And so the Buddha invites us here, as my understanding, to really look at what are we doing that leads to essentially this experience of sloth and torpor. And so, of course, one of the, since we're talking about food a lot this morning, the easiest one is to essentially indulge in food. And indulging in food, that creates a lot of cloudiness, a lot of heaviness of the body, and a nice little nap that becomes a big nap after lunch. That can never be like that long enough, right? So we wake up and we're like, I just need like an 8-hour sleep, right? And as with everything, as we say in Italian, appetite comes with eating, and we start developing this appetite for sleeping. And the more we sleep, the more we want to sleep. Feels quite nice, and it's like lazy stretching. I think the Buddha talks about here. That sluggishness. We're kind of like also delighting in all of this, right? It's like, we can all, I think, pretty much easily relate to that, which is why, in the 8 precepts, we also try to sleep on very simple beds on the floor that are not too comfortable. I remember the first time I had moved actually to the United States, and I was a guest of one of my friends, and they had this like incredible I mean, in the United States, they really like mastered the luxurious bed thing. I had never seen this king size bed. I didn't even know it existed, which is bigger than matrimoniale, which is the sort of wedding bed in Italy. It's just giant. Actually, I think it's kind of like a studio flat for Italian standards. But yeah, with the bed spring and all these like different layers, like this sort of queen thing. I remember sleeping on that bed was the best sleep I had ever had in my entire life, and I wanted for it to continue forever. I think that's when my sort of taste for there's that type of deva. I can't remember the name. There's a deva ram where one can actually just sleep for eons and eons and eons, and that is kind of like how I imagine it. I'm really savoring it, huh? In fact, when I remember reading about that deva, I was like, that's not a bad rebirth. I think not very interested in the deva rebirth, but that one sounds like a nice break. So yeah, really understanding how are we cultivating that taste for that type of experience, and how are we doing it in sort of small little steps in every moment, and how that then is becoming a plague for the sharpness of mind to come into being, how it becomes an obstacle towards putting right effort essentially in everything that we need to do, both in restraint of body, speech, and mind, and also in establishing mindfulness and establishing ourselves in concentration. And then the Buddha continues, and what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen restlessness and remorse, and for the increase and expansion of arisen restlessness and remorse? There is monastics unsettledness of mind, frequently giving careless attention to it is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen restlessness and remorse, and for the increase and expansion of arisen restlessness and remorse. So here I would say that, yeah, I mean, very common hindrance is once again wanting to do something, that agitation of mind, but also all the thoughts, oh, I could have done this, I should have been a better person, oh, like, what have I done? And yeah, it's very important to actually, I would say, in order to um, address this hindrance to, well, first of all, take on the practice of sila that the Buddha has given us. So taking the 5 precepts. And that creates a basis for us, at least, not to do things that we will regret in the future. And also to have a basis that we can actually actively bring to the mind, recollect. There is a beautiful practice of silanussati that is actually highly recommended by the Buddha to really recollect how great we are. So we don't want to be, we have this like fake humility going on in the West of like, oh yeah, I shouldn't say, shouldn't laud myself, etc. And yeah, we definitely don't praise arrogance, but we praise actually sila. So we actually should be really proud that we haven't killed any sentient being for 1 hour, 5 hours, 1 day, 1 year, 10 years, their entire life. Incredible, like however long it has been. And even if it was even before the precepts, wow, fantastic. Must be that we have taken these precepts in past lives. But yeah, not taking it for granted, but actually really bringing it up and going like, yeah, Ayya Soma, you're not killing. That's fantastic. Whoa, how wonderful. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's great. Well, you've killed in the past. That's true. Yeah, little sentient beings. That's true. But now you're not. That is something to be really, really happy about. So that's a smart and wise way to actually address remorse. So acknowledging, yeah, that harm has been done in the past, but it's the past. That was another person. What has been done has been done. We actually can be quite real of like having that constant remorse. And culturally, I feel like maybe if someone is Protestant, there is that sense of shame that is a little bit different from guilt, but they're probably somewhat kind of interconnected. So maybe even if we don't have a Catholic upbringing, there's the Protestant upbringing. Bhante Sudaza, remember, did not know what guilt was. He had a difficult time understanding that. He definitely knew what shame was. So whatever it is, all of those kind of we want to indulge with. It doesn't make us better practitioners or better people, but actually it just keeps on nourishing our sense of identification of like, I am the killer, I am the whatever person who had committed that action. But rather, no, there was killing that had been done in the past. That's it. That's over. Now we are established in yeah, in this practice. And when it comes to restlessness, of course, instead, it's the encouragement is to really look at the sign of tranquility, which is very counterintuitive because we're like, well, my mind is all over the place and there's this constant agitation. How can there be any sort of sign of tranquility anywhere? But actually, there always is. For example, if we're still in meditation, well, that stillness has a mark, has a connotation of tranquility, right? So we can actually really intentionally point our mind towards that and feed that tranquility to the mind. And therefore stop being essentially what the Buddha, if I remember correctly, analogizes this hindrance as being a slave, right? Have like no sort of freedom to do anything. And the sutta continues, in what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen doubt and for the increase and expansion of arisen doubt? There are monastics, things that are the basis for doubt. Frequently giving careless attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of unarisen doubt and for the increase and expansion of arisen doubt. Doubt seems to be one of my worst friends in meditation practice. Not anymore, luckily, but sometimes it still arises here and there. Luckily, not in meditation practice anymore. And the reason why it doesn't arise anymore in meditation practice is that it has been starved out by simply really reflecting on the encouragement that the Buddha gives us, which is simply don't pay attention to things that arise doubt. So if something is the cause of doubt, why would we actually invite it in the mind and keep reflecting on it? So it's something that we actually do whenever we have doubt about our meditation practice, about Buddhism, about whatever it is that we have doubt. It's just so bizarre to actually indulge like really investigate, put all our resources in that activity. So we literally have a choice. It's quite remarkable how easy it is. I can't remember which sutta it was, but when I read that instruction from the Buddha, it just really revolutionized the way that I was looking at that. And yeah, understanding that essentially it's no different than, for example, if we're looking to open a door and we have a bunch of different keys. And then we start, instead of actually trying out the key, we start going like, I don't know if this key is really like the capable key of really fitting into the lock or whatever it's called. And like we can go and start intellectualizing all these keys and then giving up eventually, and we're still locked outside. So what's the whole point? So it's really, really bizarre how how we would never do we would never have this sort of attitude. We have quite a lot of common sense actually when it comes to worldly things like trying out a key if we need to open a door. But when it comes to our mind, we're completely clueless and we literally fall into Mara's trap. That Mara with instilling different doubts in our mind. So yeah, of course, there is this, but also there's also other things that we're constantly nourishing in our mind, which is our obviously our sense of self. Who was I in the past? What will I be in the future, and so forth. So all of those essentially kind of questions that then create that sort of wrong investigation that leads actually not only to this hindrance of doubt, but also to a sense of self, a sense of this is, there is this being that was something in the past that is something right now and will be something in the future. And in that way, essentially, the Buddha essentially creates the simile of whenever we're experiencing this hindrance, it's like being lost in the desert. And as soon as we overcome this hindrance, instead, it's kind of going back to, back to safety, to a land where, actually all of our possessions, all of our the things that we care about are intact, and we're like, finally, I'm not in that sort of state of uncertainty and that it's not unsure anymore. And then the sutta continues. The Buddha actually ends by saying, just as this body monastic sustained by nutriment subsists independence on nutriment and does not subsist without nutriment, so too the 5 hindrances sustained by nutriment subsist independence on nutriment and do not subsist without nutriment. And just as this body sustained by nutriment subsists independence on nutriment, so too the 7 factors of enlightenment sustained by nutriment subsist independence on nutriment and do not subsist without nutriment. So essentially this sutta beautifully goes from starving out the hindrances to actually nourishing what needs to be nourished, which is the 7 enlightenment factors. And the Buddha says, and what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness? There are monastics things that are the basis for the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. Frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of mindfulness. So in essence, the cultivation of the 4 Satipatthanas. So I'll just, since we're kind of running out of time, we'll just go briefly through the enlightenment factors. Bhante Sudaso is actually planning on giving a talk this Saturday on it. So I think it's not necessary to go too much into depth. And then the Buddha continues. And what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of discrimination of states and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of discrimination of states? There are monastics, wholesome and unwholesome states, blamable and blameless states, inferior and superior states, dark and bright states with their counterparts. Frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of discrimination of states and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of discrimination of states. And actually what comes to mind here is those beautiful suttas where the Buddha describes himself as an unenlightened bodhisattva, which are actually my favorite suttas because, the the suttas, including the Bhikkhuni Samyutta, the stories of enlightened beings, are inspiring in one way, but also like demoralizing in another, in the sense that we're kind of not quite there yet. So we're like, oh, wah, wah. But the suttas, when the Buddha describes himself as a non-enlightened bodhisattva with greed, hatred, and delusion appearing in his mind and in his actual life, as the lifetime, not previous lifetimes, but actually the lifetime where he became essentially a Sammasambuddha. Those are really relatable, and also they make you feel so much better about yourself, in the way you're like, wow, even the Buddha, it's very humbling, right? You're like, even the Buddha, with clearly all the paramis that the Buddha cultivated through countless lifetimes, not only to become an awakened being, but actually to become a Sammasambuddha, an awakened being that also is capable of teaching others. Someone who actually, most importantly, finds the teachings, finds the Dhamma all by himself. I mean, it's already difficult to follow the teachings of the Buddha once a Buddha, is here. Like, we're in the era of Shakyamuni Buddha. Actually, right now we have like an unprecedented level of information of Dhamma, that you can go to Sutta Central with the link that you've seen, like literally Google any teaching of the Buddha. That's incredible. It's remarkable. Like, I don't think we've ever had that in 2,600 years. Yet, there's hardly any enlightened beings in the world, right? So even though we have access to the Dhamma, it's quite difficult to realize the Dhamma. So just imagine not having any suttacentral.net, no any monastic around, not even lay monastics around, like zero, like literally zero out there, and actually discovering the Dhamma, discovering things as they are. I mean, requires just an incredible level of perfect conditions. Yet, even with those perfect conditions, those perfect paramis, perfections of mind, even the Buddha, while in meditation practice, had thoughts of greed, hatred, and delusion appearing in the mind. Incredible, incredible. So why are we expecting our mind to be pure without any greed, hatred, and delusion, right? But how does the Buddha essentially address this? Well, without being ashamed, without being, surprised even that these thoughts of greed, hatred, and delusion appear in the mind, but rather looking at them and going and evaluating them, really doing this analysis of like, okay, what are these thoughts? Are these thoughts beneficial for myself? Are these thoughts beneficial for others? Are these thoughts beneficial for myself and others? And so understanding, also, when I'm restrained or versus unrestrained. So really evaluating essentially what happens, what are the causes and consequences in the mind, and really doing this, this evaluation for ourselves experientially. And then Sutta continues, and what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of energy and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of energy? There are monastics the element of arousal, the element of endeavor, the element of exertion. Frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of energy and for the fulfillment, development of the arisen enlightenment factor of energy. So when we're doing, essentially the practice that we are just talking about just now, so essentially from discriminating states, then naturally, right effort is developed. Naturally, we're like, yeah, let's do it. Naturally, like, all right, let's, exhaust this thought of greed, this thought of hatred, this thought of delusion. Right? Like, it naturally comes from there because we feel it. Like, this is really unhealthy. This kind of sucks. we throw it out. Or similarly, when we really understand, like virtuous behavior, the pleasantness, even, for example, of not killing, of like the subsiding of those of that irritation, the subsiding of all that internal agitation that comes from unwholesome actions. Yeah, we are determined to keep our behavior consistent, so that we want, like something, a good result, We're not, we're really not silly, actually. So when we start seeing things as they truly are, there's that natural, essentially, strength that comes in pursuing this path. And what monastics is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of rapture and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of rapture? There are monastics, things that are the basis for the enlightenment factor of rapture, and frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the arisen enlightenment factor of rapture. And for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of rapture. A little bit difficult when English is your second language. But yeah, so when we are arising, then the energy that we were talking about earlier, naturally, piti is aroused. Naturally, there is, this rapture that pervades the whole body. And then, of course, this leads actually to the next enlightenment factor, that is, the Buddha says, what is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of tranquility, and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of tranquility? There are monastics, tranquility of body, tranquility of mind, and frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of tranquility, and for the fulfillment by development of the arisen enlightenment factor of tranquility. And actually, with rapture, so with piti, tranquility essentially comes by default. It's kind of like a natural result. We don't even have to like work too hard for it. It's just like, oh, this is just quite nice. And from there, so we see actually how all of these enlightenment factors are pretty much one connected to each other. It's kind of like a domino effect, essentially. So we tend to think that it's just like so difficult, but really, not really so difficult. Actually, there's a lot of things that we're doing that are a lot more difficult, that prevent all of this from essentially coming to being. And so from there we go briefly, because we are kind of going close to the end of our time together this morning. So then the Buddha says, what is the nutriment for the unarisen enlightenment factor of concentration, the sign of serenity, and the sign of non-dispersal? And so frequently giving attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of concentration. So essentially the enlightenment factor of samadhi. And of course, because a happy mind, essentially, happy and tranquil mind is easily concentrated. So we have two factors that essentially lead naturally into that. The Buddha says that over and over again, which is also why it's so important to cultivate sila. Sila naturally, automatically uplifts the mind. The practices that we were saying also earlier, sila nusati, and also recollecting actually Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha. Those are all practices where we literally can easily uplift the mind. And when the mind is happy, naturally goes towards concentration. And lastly, the last the last enlightenment factor of equanimity the Buddha says there are monastics things that are the basis for the enlightenment factor of equanimity. Frequently giving careful attention to them is the nutriment for the arising of the unarisen enlightenment factor of equanimity. And this sounds, a little bit like, okay, well, in order to develop equanimity, you just pay attention to um, things that are the basis for the enlightenment factor of equanimity. What do you mean by that? But literally, really, when we look at it, what brings essentially equanimity? And it's an exercise of non-reactivity. It's that exercise of never like going pushing and pulling towards something, right? And so in looking at the mind that is concentrated with equanimity, so not grasping too much for that deliciousness of that different stages of samadhi, right? That then can continue growing that. And then the sutta continues, just as this body because sustained by nutrients subsists independence on nutriment and does not subsist without nutriment, so too these 7 factors of enlightenment sustained by nutriment subsist independence on nutriment and do not subsist without nutriment. And actually, I wanted to end with a little quote from another sutta that comes actually a little bit later, but that I always find very, very inspiring, because actually sometimes there can be a little bit of this sort of sense of anxiety of all those hindrances that plague our experience, and we're like, oh, how do we starve them out? I understand that I'm nourishing them, but how do I starve them out? And also all these these bojjhangas. Okay, I understand the theory, but literally, how is this really possible? And in Samyutta Nikaya 4638, actually, a Buddha says precisely something that I find so inspiring. When monastics, a noble disciple listens to the Dhamma with eager ears, attending to it as a matter of vital concern, directing their whole mind to it. On that occasion, the 5 hindrances are not present in them. On that occasion, the 7 factors of enlightenment go to fulfillment by development. So it's very easy. Very, very simple. Right? Listening to the Dhamma with eager ears, attending to it as a matter of vital concern, directing their whole mind towards it. And that occasion, no 5 hindrances, and all the 7 factors of enlightenment right here, right there. Very easy, very, very, very easy. Now we also understand a little bit better all those they sound a little bit miraculous, all the suttas, where the Buddha speaks and they're like, boom, stream enter, boom, non-returner, boom, arhat. But literally, it's actually very, very accessible, very capable for all of us to accomplish. All right, so we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and we have 5 minutes left, so let's see if there's lots of friends that are checking in. Good to see your friends. Kumanal, Usha, Angela, Yankee, Lo, Niranjan, DK. Kobe, Anusha, Roberto, Miguel, Anthony, Sujan. Okay, great. I don't see any questions. Great, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about clarification on one of the things you mentioned about the sign of the beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
In another sutta, in the Bojjhanga Samyutta, it says, Oh, I can't. Something about loving kindness is culminates in the liberation of the mind through the beautiful. Are you familiar with that? I'm trying to find the exact page. Loving kindness imbued with it. Oh, I'm missing it.
Yeah, I think perhaps there's
I
different things. So yeah, essentially.
Oh, yeah, I found it. He enters and dwells in the deliverance of the beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
So the release, loving kindness based, accompanied, and how bhikkhus is liberation of the mind by loving kindness developed. And it says here, oh yes, here. I found it. Thank you for your patience.
No problem.
He enters and dwells in the deliverance of the beautiful. Bhikkhus, the liberation of mind by loving kindness, has the beautiful as its culmination.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted just to clarify, because I think you said in your talk that we don't contemplate the sign of the beautiful when developing aversion.
Yeah, I think in this in this sutta, the one that we just went through, it's a little bit different, like the mark of the beautiful, in the sense it's not what the Buddha is addressing there, but rather it's more related to kamachanda, so to sensuality. So essentially, the escape is there's like different levels of what we can call suba, different levels of what we can call beautiful. So the beauty of the mark of the beautiful of, for example, a good-looking person is radically different than the mark of the beautiful of loving kindness meditation, right? That sentiment of loving kindness. Do you understand the difference? So that's why, in fact, to counteract ill will, one should not go, for example, if one is not attracted to the person or looks at the sort of horrible traits of the person, in order to counteract that hindrance, one should not be like focusing on how instead attractive that person is. That's not the point. We don't want to essentially create conditions for more worldly attachments to happen, but rather we cultivate the mind of loving kindness, right? So if I'm like, oh, Bob is really gross, I don't go, oh, but like, look at Bob's nice ears. That would be a little bit silly, right?
Yeah.
But rather, like, let's cultivate loving kindness. So then it doesn't matter if it's Bob, if it's Michael, if it's Gina, whatever it is, like, that uplifts the mind, and it's not it's not dominated by craving, but rather it's a sublime sort of mind state. It's a divine state.
May I see if I understand you?
Yes.
So the mark of the sign of the beautiful, if ill will is arising, is not to see that not to focus on the physically attractive features, but maybe the more spiritually attractive, like this person is very kind.
No, you don't want to use it on people. So you want to the loving kindness. If you're attracted to someone,
no, I'm misunderstanding.
Okay.
So if you have ill will,
yes,
you don't focus on their physically attractive features. You focus on this person is being kind to my teacher.
Yeah, actually, that's
like
very good.
You appreciate their good qualities that aren't necessarily physical.
Yes. Actually, that's a very good way of addressing it. Yeah, that's very well said. Yeah, we don't want to replace aversion with any type of desire, definitely not sexual attraction towards someone that we find repulsive. That would be a very silly sort of pursuit.
So understanding what spiritual beauty is, and not like that's I think.
Well,
different
I
types
mean,
of beauty.
ultimately what we're trying to do is eliminate these instructions are to eliminate the hindrances.
Yeah.
So of course, usually the hindrances are, especially if it's not in meditation practice, they're manifested towards something in particular that we are experiencing, right?
Mm-hmm.
In meditation practice, sometimes it's something we're experiencing, but sometimes we just sit down and we're like, whoa, everything sucks. Like there's that kind of sort of sensation of dukkha, like distress, there's nothing there. Or there's a strong desire that is indefinite, like we start seeing how these hindrances essentially sometimes don't have an object. Do you see what I mean? They're just kind of present in and of themselves. So developing a mind of loving kindness, it's kind of putting salt on the soil. So it sterilizes the soil so that ill will cannot take foot.
Oh.
Do you see what I mean? If the soil is fertile, so if during the whole day we're like, oh, this sucks, and this other thing sucks, and this other thing sucks, and this other thing sucks, we are actually making some really fertile soil for aversion to land, for ill will to land. That can be both an experience of mind in and of itself, of just like, being like, just grumpy all the time, whether in formal meditation or informal meditation. But also towards specific people. Do you see what I mean? Because then the level of tolerance will be very low. So everything is triggering, hate everyone, like, I hate this monastery, I hate the world, and so forth, right? Similarly, for desire, if we're constantly like, oh, this building is so beautiful, oh, like these people are so beautiful, oh, like this book is so beautiful, oh, like, constantly paying attention to everything that is pretty, then there is that desire, that constant, wanting to experience the world essentially with all the six senses, I would say, because Kamachandra can be also a very strong mental experience.
Can the hindrances feed on themselves? Can you have hatred or ill will towards ill will? Oh, I hate hate. I hate hate. I hate hate. Hate sucks. What do you like? Oh, sloth and torpor is just so hard to deal with. I can't be bothered to deal with sloth and torpor. You know what I mean? Oh, I really don't like anxiety. Ugh.
I mean,
what am I going to do about this anxiety?
But what is your question, right? If they
can they feed on? So you can't hate away hate. Right?
No. No, the only way essentially to starve it out is by cultivating the Brahmaviharas fundamentally. So not creating a breeding ground for it to germinate. And Anthony says, good to see you, by the way, Anthony. Anthony was a resident here for quite some time. Linda remembers him. Okay. Linda says hello. Oh, and also Ethan, apparently. And Joe. Well, everybody is. Anthony, you're very popular. You should come back. So Anthony says, beauty of metta different than beauty that lends itself to sensual passion. I think we spoke about it actually just right now. So yeah, I think we addressed that clearly. If something is unclear, you can follow up. You're welcome to. Anything else, or it's good?
What comes up, I learned that there's a word that is often brought up in art is the sublime. Is something that you appreciate from a distance because you see the danger, like the beauty of a mountain or a hurricane is something that you can appreciate, but from a distance. You wouldn't want to be in the hurricane, you wouldn't want to embrace the hurricane, but from a distance you can appreciate the magnitude of its awe and how nature is, how small you are in comparison to it. So there's the appreciation of the dangerous, the harmful thing is known as the sublime. is that helpful in the practice where we can say, oh, this like if if women are sharks, like a shark is sublime. It's a beautiful from a distance.
Yeah, I wouldn't go there. Yeah, especially if there's one particular hindrance. Yeah, for example, it's kind of funny that you talk about the arts, because actually that is something that my mind gravitates very much towards it, because I in particular developed a lot of mark of the beautiful in that field. I mean, it was also my profession. So the way usually that I address that particular defilement is in two ways. One, by simply restraining myself and not going there. Two, redirecting it towards something that is more wholesome. So, for example, Buddha statues. Love Buddha statues. And or things, objects that, yeah, like creating spaces where people are inspired to practice. So anything that is within the realms of the Dhamma is a way so that that vipaka can actually be reinterpreted and goes well. But if there's like the other day that we went to the Met with Ajahn Brahmali, so it used to be one of my favorite museums. So what did I do? I just stayed in the in the department, the one that was all Buddha statues. But in fact, as soon as I got actually at a certain point, there were all the Gandhara statues, and then there was a room that I don't know why, it makes no sense, adjacent to it. It was this Japanese fashion sort of room that seemed like it was part of the Buddhist rooms. But I entered there, and there was like, oh, Issei Miyake and lots of things that I like from a previous life within this life, as well as different people that like all of these things. It was really interesting because for a second I was very unmindful, and I was like, oh, I like this place. Oh, it's a happy land. So, but I caught myself immediately, and I was like, no, just don't go there. And so I exited the room. So there's some things that one needs to asanas that need to be transcended by avoidance. So we want to starve them out, and we know we can understand, aside from the indications that the Buddha gives us, by looking at how the mind goes. Whenever there is delighting here and there, that's essentially the cause of our suffering. We start delighting here and there, and that creates the conditions for us wanting to continue to experience, to exist. It's basically our bhavatanha. So in that moment, it was like bhavatanha, oh, Japanese, everything. Oh, yay. Oh, my friends from fashion, bhavatanha, right? So we just go it out. So this practice is very intentional. The reason the Buddha gives us all these instructions and explains to us what is the nutriment for the hindrances, what is the nutriment for the enlightenment factors, is to really empower us to understand what to nourish and what to starve, like it were a baby. Like a baby. You nourish it, you want to feed it, and you want to starve it. Well, okay. Let's not extend too much to metaphor. I never had maternal instincts. Maybe that's why. Okay. Daniel, yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering about Ayya Soma and how I can recognize that a hindrance has arisen, and I can recognize what does the hindrance feel like, what programs the hindrance, what's keeping the hindrance alive, etc. So basically, as it is, it's like this, knowing it without creating that attention as unwise attention. Does that make sense? So making sure that I can be aware of and be with and be understanding of the hindrance without giving unwise attention to it.
Well, Yoniso Manasikara actually was very helpful when I was translating the Trigatha to actually understand, because it's usually translated as wise attention, but literally it means basically paying attention to the origin of things. So Yoni actually means womb. So the creation of all things, essentially. So when we actually understand in that way, what does it mean? Basically, wise attention. That is, of course, a good translation, but really, wise attention means dependent origination. So looking at the origin, where are things coming from? So as you described, everything that you've described sounds like wise attention, because you're looking at dependent origination. So by definition, it cannot be unwise attention. You see what I mean? Like it cannot go against.
So would you go so far as to say that Ayya Soma and Sikara, in respect to the hindrances, would be giving attention to them without recognizing their arising and their ceasing and the creation of them, etc.?
Well, careless attention, my understanding of it in the context of the hindrances, is to do essentially things that feed the hindrances. So it's something that we're doing. So yeah, in the kind of plain example of like, the food, this, like we're actually doing something and kind of not, like we're just carelessly doing it, because it's also like trivial. So what I feel like is very difficult to fully understand experientially in the practice is the gravity of our actions, because a lot of these actions are really trivial. Like looking at, almond butter and looking forward for almond butter. I don't know why I'm using this almond butter thing so often, although I appreciated seeing almond butter on the table. It's very sweet. Oh, Satu. Must be, like my subconscious. But yeah, it's fine. I was like, oh. But yeah, something like that. Literally, it's really trivial. It's not something that we think it's immoral, because it's not immoral. But everything is it's something that we're doing. It's fueling a tendency of mind. It's fueling that delight and lust, that savoring of things. Even like when we're, eat, like the whole process of food. That's the thing that was my biggest difficulty entering the Buddhist path. So I've observed a lot because it's the unofficial Italian religion. So it was very difficult for me to give it up with Buddhism. Literally, so many different emotions, so many different defilements, and so much difficulty to understand actually the gravity of, and the gravity, once again, not that you're going to hell, but the gravity of in terms of strengthening a habit of mind. So that's what we do. I think what the Buddha is pointing out in terms of Ayya Soma Manasikara. Also, when we're indulging in thoughts, there is this beautiful sutta, I can't remember what it's called in Majjhima Nikaya, where someone asks the Buddha essentially if it's worse karma to essentially do an unwholesome action or think an unwholesome action. And the Buddha says to think an unwholesome action. I was shocked. At the very beginning, I was like, how is this possible? It's so counterintuitive. Like, it's not possible. Of course, there's no physical action without a mental action ahead of time. You can't kill if you haven't created the thought of killing to begin with. So it's always going, to the root of things. But we think, as long as I'm not killing ants, I can think about killing ants the entire day. It's harmless. So we tend to think in that way. Like we tend to approach it in that way. I feel like this personally is the most sort of deep-rooted habit that is difficult to remove, which creates that kind of unwise attention, not seeing the origin of things, not seeing that, just engaging in that tendency of mind of like, I want to get rid of the ants, I want to exterminate the ants, may the ants not be with me, blah, 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 blah. Like creates killing that then creates a lot of suffering, essentially. I don't know if it made sense.
I think I understood at the very beginning what you seem to be saying is that Yoniso Manasikara in regard to the hindrances would be not recognizing that what you're doing is creating greater desire or greater ill will or greater etc.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's very clear.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate you bringing up that sutta, because I feel like that's something that's come up, and I'd love to hear more teachings on in the future if you'd be compassionate enough to do so. Because I know in my past, I thought like thoughts were safe, like I think, or like playing video games, right? Like a lot of video games are violent, and you think it's safe to indulge in those power fantasies in a safe way, so there's the intention of, I don't want to actually harm beings, but you want to, indulge in those fantasies in a safe way. But you're telling us that the Buddha says that's ignorance.
Correct.
And once we understand that's ignorance, then the foundation is we don't actually want to harm anyone.
Correct.
And so we will abandon even the thinking in order to be completely safe for ourselves and others.
Correct. And actually video games, even without doing the killing video games, but just video games in general, it's remarkable how it's considered so sort of, unimportant in terms of it's not an immoral thing, but how obstructive it is. It's actually quite remarkable. In all these years of Buddhist insights, it's been the number one reason of people who had the perfect sort of conditions of going forth, that they couldn't let go of playing video games, which to me was like the most bizarre thing I had ever heard. Or entertainment, in this country, like in the United States, there's such a strong, it's just the biggest sort of cultural hindrance of entertainment, both movies, like things like that. So for me, it was food. You gotta eat anyway as a monastic. So, but yeah, so for me, it was very difficult to understand. And there I saw the gravity of it, up until actually seeing this really intense struggle for people, even people leaving retreats because of that. Like, forget about ordination, like just couldn't stay 2 days without like entertainment, or 1 day, like going completely crazy. Yeah, you're all making those true stories. And I'm not talking about crazy folks, like completely reasonable, very moral people. So all of these things are a lot of the things that we do that we don't give too much importance to, actually have incredible consequences, incredible implications. And indulging in food actually has a lot of incredible implications that I saw for myself. But at the very beginning, I was like, what's the point? What's the problem? Like, actually, the only drawback that I saw with food prior to Buddhism was, being a little overweight. And I was like, well, I'm not vain, so who cares? Right? But there's not understanding the kind of larger implications that doing certain actions has. So it's fantastic, isn't it great, the Dhamma, that like the Buddha points out all of these different things. And it's this light and this darkness, and then we're like, oh, all of these little things that I was missing, now they're all perfect pieces of the puzzle. So we can respect the Buddha with 3 sadhus and end the morning together. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Oh, and hello, Venerable Dhammadina. Good to see you online. Hope all is well in India. And see you all, friends. This evening, there will be Bhante Jagaro offering some words of Dhamma.